Hello, everyone. Welcome to Global Studies. My name is Youtian Xin. I'm the chair of Global Studies and also professor in geography here at Cal. My research and teaching focus on urban geography and environmental geography, with a regional focus on China and East Asia. In this video, 3 of our all-star professors from Global Studies will talk about what we do here in the Global Studies. They will talk about the classes they teach, and also each of them will address one key question in the Global Studies. Our first speaker, Professor Darren Zook, will talk about international human rights and their relationship with race and gender. Our second speaker, Professor Karenja Bangu-Rondawa, will talk about climate change and its relationship with resource conflicts and resolutions. And our third speaker, Professor Crystal Chan-Cohen, will talk about technology competition between the US and China. So let me introduce our first speaker, Professor Darren Zook. Professor Zook's research and teaching has been focusing on international law, human rights, the interface between politics and culture, and also the question of identity. Geographically, Professor Zook covers a very large part of the world. His research and teaching started from South Asia, especially Southern India, but before we know it, he has expanded across different continents. Most recently, he has been exploring the resource management questions and also tourism in the Nordic lands, especially Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands. He has even claimed some interplanetary fields, such as user space law, in his teaching and research on international law. Currently, we are all very eager to see Professor Zook's new publication entitled The Politics of Guess What? Cocktail Making. Well, that shouldn't come as a surprise because Professor Zook is not just a star professor, eloquent speaker, but also a Renaissance man. He's a surfer, he's a mountain biker, he's a musician, and also a gourmet cook. He's very good at integrating his academic work with many of his talents. So here is Professor Zook and his take on international human rights.
Well, a great hello to all of you out there in, Zoom land or Berkeley town, wherever you're watching this, welcome. I'm here to give you a few words about the relationship between human rights and global studies. If you're wondering who I am Darren Zook, as you can see. And I'll tell you a little bit more about myself when I talk about the classes I teach in just 1 second. So what I'm going to do is I've got some slides to share with you, and I am going to, as if by magic, call them up for you. Are you ready? Great. Here we go. Well, that was amazing. That's how we roll here in Global Studies. We just pull things out of thin air like we're magicians. Magicians of knowledge, I should say. The cover picture here on the slide, by the way, is from the Atacama Desert in Chile. I only chose it because, Global Studies is kind of like a journey. And I was thinking, I need a picture that represents, some place that you really want to go. So hopefully you're looking at this picture going, I want to be on that road. Well, let's call that road Global Studies. Yeah, we're going to do that. So let me just very briefly talk to you about, exactly how human rights and global studies link together. First of all, what is global studies, you might ask, and how is it different from some other major? Well, to understand how we map the academic disciplines, otherwise known as majors, The question becomes, what distinguishes the academic disciplines? What's the difference between geography, global studies, political science, nuclear physics? What distinguishes them, believe it or not, is really the questions they ask. Now, obviously, someone in nuclear physics is probably going to ask a very different question than, say, someone in global studies, but there are ways to link them. We do talk about things like nuclear non-proliferation in global studies, and there would be plenty of common ground to discuss something with someone who worked in nuclear physics, whether it's for nuclear energy or studying non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. So if the questions that are asked would be the thing that defines a discipline, well, then what distinguishes global studies? Well, what distinguishes global studies is the questions it asks. It asks very different questions than, say, political science or sociology or economics and other fields, although it does communicate very effectively with them. If I had to identify the three things that really kind of makes global studies what it is, it would be these three things. First of all, we make connections. And you might think, well, don't all disciplines and majors make connections? Yes, but global studies does it in a way that really does make us think outside the box. We connect things that in many ways might not seem on the surface to be connected. We take a multidisciplinary perspective and we use all of those toolkits to find a way to connect things that in ways that might, open up new possibilities for analysis. Secondly, we understand processes, and that's, a fancy word for saying kind of, anything as it plays out anywhere in the world. And what's interesting about global studies is we do that. It's called global studies, and you might think it studies globalization and only global processes. No. We study everything from the micro-local to the global, and we make those connections along the way. So what's happening in Berkeley versus what's happening in California versus the United States versus North America versus global North, global South, everything from the local to the global. And lastly, exploring solutions, using a toolkit to understand what is at the root of a problem, to understand what might be the most effective solution, or the solution that no one has thought of yet. You can probably already see how human rights would fit into this quite naturally. But before I do that, let me talk about this picture. And you'll see I have a caption on it that says the question of violence. This is a picture. There's just so much going on in this picture, by the way. This is a picture from the current protests in Myanmar, otherwise known as Burma. What's happening here? Well, first of all, you see someone carrying a sign that says, "Free our leader, Daw Aung San Suu Kyi." And you might be thinking, I thought she kind of fell from grace. I thought she was kind of, a persona non grata. Not in Myanmar. Myanmar, she's still highly respected. So that's one whole question as to, what happened to her reputation globally. Former Nobel Peace Prize winner, former champion of human rights and democracy, now kind of ignored, if not despised, by many leaders around the world, largely due to what happened, her stance on what's happening at the border between Myanmar and Bangladesh right now with the Rohingya refugee crisis. The second thing you'll notice is people are going like this. What's going on with that? That really is the Hunger Games salute, if you know what that is. And you're thinking, where'd they get that from? Well, they actually borrowed it from protests in Thailand. Thailand actually has a law against doing the three-finger Hunger Games salute. So they're picking this up, it's like Hollywood. How do we get from Hollywood to the Myanmar protests? But the real heart of the question here is, we know the protests in Myanmar have turned violent. And global studies spends a lot of time looking at that moment when the line is crossed, when the decision is made to deploy violence, especially lethal violence. And that's as true of when the nation state might do it, as in, say, Tatmadaw, otherwise known as Myanmar's military. It's also equally important to understand if the protesters themselves choose violence. Questions of, what does it do to the moral standing of the claim of the protest? What does it do to the validity of the protest? Was violence the right call? Lots of questions embedded in this. And so that's just an introduction to kind of what global studies is. Let me talk next about human rights. In a nutshell, human rights are one pathway, not the only pathway, but one pathway to justice. Each pathway plays a different role. So you kind of have to know If I'm fighting for justice, whatever my cause is, what's the most effective path to follow? It might be human rights, but it might be other things, and it's not mutually exclusive. It might be a human rights case plus something else, change of policy, for instance. What are human rights? Human rights are a part of this larger thing called international law. So look at human rights as a subset of international law. What else does international law include? It includes things like international business law through the World Trade Organization, for instance. Also what's called international humanitarian law, which is centered around the Geneva Conventions, which basically governs things like war crimes, use of force crimes, anything relating to war and armed conflict. So human rights is a part of that, and law is a part of global studies, but of course, global studies is more than just the study of law. That's part of it. So human rights, in essence, gives us a toolkit that offers a structured approach to obtaining justice. That structured approach is very important because you can see here we have a picture of, Save the Planet, Save the Human, Amnesty International, well-known international human rights organization. Of course, there's a sign that says go vegan, so we have that discussion as well. This is obviously a demonstration. Demonstrations have their part to play. They are usually expressions of solidarity about a particular cause, and that's important, but don't confuse holding a demonstration with obtaining justice. That's a different process, especially as it relates to human rights. And those are the kinds of questions we look at in global studies. What role does a demonstration play? What role does a protest play? What role would human rights play in terms of offering that structured approach, that structured legal approach to obtaining justice? Human rights, by the way, does not, even though rights are in essence legal entities, legal concepts, but human rights does not necessarily have to play out only in the world of law. There is human rights as public policy. There's human rights as simply a normative change for how to see the world. For instance, go vegan. Someone saying your diet plays some important role in relation to human rights and justice. So change your diet if you want to change the world for the better and things like that. So human rights plays out in multiple ways. And again, the nice thing about global studies is we can explore all of them. We don't have to just see it as law. We don't have to just see it as policy. We don't have to just see it as, normative social change. We can see it in all ways and then try to make the connections between which of these strategies is more successful or which of these strategies has been more effective over time. Putting the two together, human rights and global studies. Let me just give you a brief overview as to, for instance, how human rights situates in the global studies curriculum based upon my own personal experience. Number one, Global Studies 10A is kind of our flagship introduction class. It's a class I teach usually every other semester. I trade on and off currently with the wonderful Professor Michael Watts. And Introduction to Global Studies has a module. It's basically centered around 5 modules is the way I've set up the class. And one of those modules is called basically justice. And justice comes in lots of different varieties. It comes in local questions of justice. It comes in international questions of justice. But it's an introduction to human rights as it situates within international law and within these larger questions of justice. And justice can be things like racial justice, questions about reparations, questions about police accountability. What role should the police play? All those questions are human rights questions, but they're also questions of justice that may or may not directly play into human rights. Secondly, I teach a class called Global Studies 10B, which is my version. There's different versions of Global Studies 10B. Mine is called Food, Drink, Culture, Politics. All those things basically come together at the same time. It's not, 2 weeks of food, then drink, then culture and politics. It's everything's on the table, so to speak, at the same time. But part of the class addresses issues like food security or water security, water as a human right. It may surprise you to know that there's nothing in the human rights framework that actually states that water is a fundamental human right, access to water. And you're thinking, well, don't we need water to live? How is that not the case? Well, that's an interesting question. And those are the kinds of questions we explore. How can we write treaty after treaty in the human rights world and not have a single sentence that says human beings are entitled to access to clean, drinkable water? That gets into questions of who's writing these treaties, who would not want that to be the case, why has it taken so long, why are people still fighting for this? How do we get access to water? Should we turn it over to corporations, or should we privatize water rights? Those are the kinds of things that I would talk about, say, in Global Studies 10B. If you really want to focus on human rights, I teach an entire class on international human rights, Global Studies 173. And in that class, we spend the entire semester just breaking down every aspect of the human rights world. The treaties, both international treaties and regional treaties. We talk about how the laws are configured. We apply them to specific case studies. We do a whole several-week segment on what I call human rights and identity, where we talk about indigenous rights and minority rights. What do you do when you have a culture, for instance, that has a practice that some people say violates human rights, but then that culture says, yes, but if we change, you're violating our right to culture, because every culture has a right to exist and practice its cultural practices. So what if those practices come under scrutiny? How do we resolve that tension? How do we resolve that issue, that dispute? We talk about refugees. We talk about borders. We talk about genocide. We talk about so many things, international human rights. It's a one-semester introduction to all of the central issues. And of course, one of the other nice things about global studies is all of these classes kind of interconnect. So if you took Global Studies 173 and then you took Global Studies 10B, or reverse, you're just building upon, you're broadening and deepening a body of knowledge through global studies. Brand new course I'm offering, Global Studies 150E, the Nordic lands. You might think, how does that relate to human rights? Well, it's so related to human rights that actually it is now part of the human rights minor on campus. Many ways we can make these connections. For instance, you may know this. Just last week, they announced for the 4th year running, Finland was the happiest country in the world, according to the World Happiness Index. So what's going on in Finland, and why are all the Nordic countries always like in the top 10 of happy countries? What's going on there? Same is true, for instance, of rankings on corruption. Corruption is a human rights issue, by the way. And, why are the Nordic lands always in the top 10 of the least corrupt countries in the world? And how is happiness and lack of corruption correlated? Wait a minute, what just happened? I just hacked into my own lecture. How's that for impressive? Anyway, I'm here to talk about something that's very important to the world of human rights as it connects to global studies. And that thing can be summed up in one word. And I know the word's going to sound a little bit kind of, jargony or buzzwordy, but the word is very important. It's a very powerful word, and you should know it. And that word is intersectionality. Specifically, I'll explain what intersectionality is by looking at two elements of the human rights world that show how intersectionality discusses or exposes what you might call kind of differential or secondary effects of something. The two things I want to focus on are race and gender. So let's take something like extreme economic inequality, which by some arguments could be seen as a sort of human rights violation. Economic inequality could, on the one hand, be seen neutrally as a difference of socioeconomic status. If we introduce the idea of intersectionality, however, we begin to understand that socioeconomic inequality affects different groups in different ways. It's not just a matter of income. It could be, for instance, that marginal groups not only experience more inequality than, say, others, but they also experience that inequality in different and more detrimental ways. And we need to understand every facet of something like economic inequality to get a true picture of what it's all about. Looking even further, you could say, for instance, that in a situation of extreme poverty or economic marginality, that in addition to having the social marginality of coming from, say, an indigenous or a minority group, then within that group, you might see that, say, gender plays a role as well, that, say, women experience the extreme inequality in ways that are more devastating than men. And it's not, a competition to see who is worse affected than someone else. That's not the point of this. The point of this is to take an already difficult situation and try to map out every facet and aspect, because if you really want to talk effectively about solutions, and in many ways this is the heart of what global studies does, you can't fix a problem unless you know every element of a problem. And so in global studies, we tend to look at intersectionality, and it is a very powerful tool in understanding the differential impact of human rights violations around the world. Okay, that's all I wanted to say for now. By the way, hacking is frowned upon by many people. So just between you and me, shh, I was never here. Okay, back to that other guy now. So, we've got conceptual classes like international human rights. We have introductory classes, which also can serve as a breadth requirement. We have region-based classes, and there's a way, if you're interested in human rights, to basically weave a very nice thread through all of it. Now, here we have one last picture of a Black Lives Matter protest, and you're probably thinking, what city is that in? Let me look in the background, is that DC? Is that Berkeley? Where is that? Well, it might surprise you. That's Helsinki, Finland. In fact, that is specifically on the steps that are right in front of Helsinki Cathedral, right in the heart of Helsinki city. And you're thinking, number one, I didn't realize they had Black Lives Matter protests in Helsinki, Finland. And number two, why are the signs mostly in English? Those are all really interesting questions. It has a lot to do with, Finland. And that's one of the many things I talk about the Nordic lands is, how do we get this picture? How do we get a Black Lives Matter protest in Helsinki, Finland? Why is Finland considered to be the happiest country in the world? What are they doing there? And how does that relate to human rights? And how does it relate, quite frankly, to food, drink, culture, politics? And you're thinking, I don't know, you tell me. Well, here's just a fun-filled trivia fact for you. Did you know that Finland drinks more coffee per capita than any country in the world? Yeah, the Finns. Who knew? And of course, it all goes back to the introduction to global studies, where you get introduced to human rights in the context of everything that global studies has to offer, which, if I've made my point clearly, is quite a lot. Well then, I will go ahead and sign off for now. Thank you for your time. Thanks for inviting me into your Zoom space. Hope you're all doing well. Hopefully, maybe I'll see you sometime in Berkeley or in the global studies major. And in the meantime, take good care.
Thank you, Darren, for the wonderful presentation. I love the technique of hacking to your own recording. Now, let me introduce our second speaker, Professor Karanja Bangul-Randhawa. She will talk about climate change and its relationship with resource conflicts and resolution. Professor Bangul-Randhawa is a scholar of peace and conflict studies. She has published many important books, including Religion and Human Security, a Global Perspective, and Conflict Across Cultures, a Unique Bridging Experience, as well as Civil Society in Malakala, Punjab, Fostering Resilience Through Religion. As you can tell from her books, she's a brilliant scholar, but she's very far from being just another egghead professor on Berkeley campus. Professor Bangul-Randhawa is a seasoned practitioner of international conflict resolutions. She applies her expertise in solving real-world problems. She has designed and delivered cross-cultural and conflict resolution training for a variety of public and private groups in the United States and internationally. The groups she has worked with included healthcare organizations, university administrations, as well as social service programs. She has also worked as a conflict resolution facilitator in city planning processes and also immigrant rights policy initiatives. She has also facilitated dialogue around racism and discrimination after the 9/11 attacks. Currently, she is researching the role of women's organizations in gender-based violence prevention, conflict transformation, and resilience within diaspora communities in Canada. She brings all these firsthand research and hands-on experiences to her classroom. That's why she's a very respected and very popular professor on Berkeley campus. In her spare time, she enjoys the outdoors and she loves being a soccer mom. Here is Professor Karanja Bangu Randawa for you.
Welcome to Cal Week and welcome to the Department of Global Studies. My name is Karanjot Bangu Randawa, and I'm here to talk to you about classes I teach in the department related to peace and conflict studies. So I teach a range of classes, including peace theory and approaches, international conflict resolution, as well as classes like religion and human security. My students tend to be reflective practitioners, so they're really focused on skill building related to conflict engagement, including learning hands-on and applied approaches such as mediation and negotiation, and thinking about how to apply skills to bigger global challenges, but also thinking about interpersonal and intergroup conflict. So as a student in my class, you might find yourself working on a range of scenarios, including family law mediation. You could be drafting a peace agreement similar to what would be implemented in a civil war context. You could also be using water diplomacy skills, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but thinking about how to solve a dispute between three countries sharing the same river basin, and just scenarios that really bring up different challenges. I ask students to think critically, engage diplomatically, and really work together to find solutions to some of the most complex problems. So to give you a sense of sort of the approach in the classes in relation to the spectrum of conflict engagement, the importance that we stress in the classes is to really think about the nuances and the consideration of complexity, whether it's related to historical memory, to justice and reconciliation. We think about non-Western or centric or non-linear ways of dealing with some challenges that can oftentimes be more impactful in building sustainable peace. So we think carefully about the intersectionality of gender, religion, and identity and culture, and understand how to build pathways and bridges across deep divides, not only in our communities, but also in global contexts. So also, given the challenges of the past year, we've been looking critically at health and humanitarianism in thinking about how it relates to global health security. And we think about concrete ways in which stakeholders from different sectors can really ensure equal access to health, and think about, different ways of interconnection in terms of political, social, and economic risks that have really been reinforced by the pandemic. A key aspect of my pedagogical approach has to do with creating community engagement as well as inclusive practice. So thinking about how do we approach difficult conversations across contexts? How do we understand issues of dominance, of power and oppression? And how do we challenge harmful cultural practices, which is just as important as honoring traditions? So we test strategies and tactics in our classes in terms of consensus building, of really connecting valuable theory and understanding to practical strategies. An example that I want to share with you in one of my classes, Global 133, which focuses on international conflict resolution, we really sort of look at the confluence of different issues in conflict context. So we think about multiple analytical tools and approaches. We look at, for example, the case study of Syria, where you have one of the most intense droughts, which resulted in crop failure and mass migration at the beginning of the Civil War. And you had a breakdown and failure of governance, but you also had proxy level aspects of involvement from other state actors. You had a transnational extremist element where you had different exacerbation points within the conflict and the violence. And so within the class, we look at how do these root causes of conflict and how do we understand them and look at the causal aspects in relation to human rights violations and food insecurity and refugee crisis. We think about intervention and we think about diplomacy and third parties. What can we learn from these situations of protracted insurgency and proxy warfare? So we're really more aware of how to address and how to come up with strategies in terms of conflict engagement when we can also understand what are the different factors that we need to take into consideration. Another important aspect to think about and not often is considered when we do conflict analysis is thinking about the impact of climate change. And when we think of climate change, we often think of wildfires in California and Australia, or heat waves in sub-Saharan Africa, or rising sea levels and coastal erosion in the Pacific. We think about the seen impact or the known impacts of climate change, but we don't necessarily think about, how does climate change interact with conflict? And so developing these strategies and approaches to prevent these consequences, but also creating mechanisms for prevention and innovative solutions is equally important. So the climate-informed discussions in the class relate to how do we promote peace and security, but also how do we understand these interrelated issues? And so an example, if we kind of bring it down from climate change to think about a contested resource, is water. So when we think of water, we might think of water scarcity, but water is also a matter of international cooperation. Research has shown that out of 55 countries involved in major conflicts, 41 have at least one shared water basin with another country, which means essentially that water cooperation is very important and actually can strengthen peace and cooperation. So generating cooperation is important, but considering how to bring stability to different regions where you have shared riparians is also critical. So you have the Mekong Delta, for example, you might have the Nile River, the Tigris, Euphrates, where we think of these shared river basins where you have political tensions between countries and water becomes a key bargaining resource. So water-stressed countries, it's projected in 2040, will include places that are also heavily impacted in terms of desalinated seawater, exceptional water-related challenges, but the science and the knowledge behind this is important in terms of how we link it to practice. And so the practice of water diplomacy is sort of a toolbox that my students use in my class and look at designing collaborative systems. So we have to consider environmentally, socially, and politically attentive ways of practice and planning when we think about water as a shared resource. A negotiation scenario might look at a shared water basin, and the Mekong Delta is actually a great example of how these various issues come into consideration. So for example, we have the Mekong River Commission, which is actually a very robust institution. We think about the Mekong Delta and track 1, track 2, track 3 level diplomacy when it comes to engagement in the water security nexus. So we think about how do states contend with water security while at the same time think about trade and technology and interstate conflict. We know that the construction of dams, for example, undermines cooperation in the Delta and threatens the livelihood of fishermen. And we also know it disrupts the river's natural rhythm. And this is where cooperation becomes critical. So in thinking about the impact and the livelihood of different communities, what we also learned from the Mekong Delta is that track 3 level people-to-people society actors are really important. So if we think of bringing scientific field experts, how do they inform our approach? What have we learned from water negotiation? One thing is that it's not necessarily always a top-down process, that we actually, we need citizen-powered initiatives to help bring in local engagement and media campaigns, for example, so that we can have a constructive dialogue in relation to scientific fact-finding and planning, but also forecasting the climate change impact. And so thinking about water diplomacy is just as important as thinking of the scientific knowledge, and merging these different skill sets together and utilizing these skill sets is something that students in my class get to do. And it's really, it's powerful experience to be, be able to engage hands-on and really be able to then bring that practical experience back to the theory and understanding concepts and ideas. So I want to say again, welcome to Cal, and I hope that you visit our department. We have a range of students from various disciplines. It's an amazing experience. I'm excited. I hope that you will join us while you are here at Cal, and that your time here is memorable. And I look forward to meeting you all very soon. Thank you again.
Thank you, Karen, for the wonderful presentation. I really enjoy learning about how you teach water diplomacy through negotiation exercises in class. Our last speaker is Professor Crystal Chan-Cohen, known to her students as Dr. Chan. Dr. Chan will talk about her classes and her take on the technology competition between the US and China. Dr. Chan is trained as a political scientist. She has been teaching in Berkeley since 2012. In addition to her own research on industrial organization in the international high-tech sector, she teaches a wide range of courses at the intersections of Asia, Silicon Valley, gender, and political economy. She's known for her innovative teaching methods, such as organizing debate teams in her classroom as a way to help students clarify some very complicated concepts. Dr. Chan's professional life also includes a lot of real-world engagements. Before coming into academia, she worked in informational technology and venture capital industries in Silicon Valley, also in Shanghai, China. Dr. Chan is an energetic and successful community activist on Berkeley campus and in the Bay Area. She's an inspiring speaker, not just in her classroom, but also in professional and community forum. She has been invited to give talks on international and US policy issues at US-China Economic and Security Review Commission, World Affairs, Rotary Club, League of Women Voters, Novato Historical Guild, and Silicon Valley Automotive Open Source. Now, some fun facts. When she's not teaching and when she's not giving lectures, Professor Chan can be found chasing her children through the hills of Marin County here in Northern California. Now, here is Dr. Crystal Chan-Cohen.
Hi, my name is Crystal Chan-Cohen, and I'm a lecturer in the Interdisciplinary Social Science program here at UC Berkeley. And today I'm here to welcome you to the Global Studies major. Allow me to share my screen. If you'd like to learn more about me, I encourage you to go to my website, www.crystalchang.com. And if you have any questions at all about the courses I teach or the Global Studies major, feel free to send me an email at crystalchang@berkeley.edu. So today I have 4 goals in my presentation. First is to provide an overview of the Global Studies major and the courses that I teach. Second is to introduce my course, Global Studies 151Q, Global China. Third is to demonstrate how we discuss and learn about the topic of US-China competition in technology in our course. And finally is to offer you a few resources in case you want to learn more about this topic on your own. But of course, I hope to see you in my class soon. So first, I want to share my thoughts about what makes the Global Studies major special. Our major engages students in the interdisciplinary study of the world, and I'll discuss more what that means in a second, and provides us an opportunity for students to understand how different regions have shaped and been shaped by the forces of globalization. So the students have broad exposure to international politics, economics, media, history, society, culture, and language, which enables them to become productive contributors to and find employment in a rapidly changing world. And of course, we have a fabulous faculty that's trained in anthropology, economics, engineering, history, law, political science, like myself, and sociology. And we are all also regional experts and can provide not only disciplinary and theory, but also a very rich background in different regions. So these are the courses that I teach. First, I offer a freshman seminar, a one-unit course called Contemplating the Past, Present, and Future of Humankind, where we kind of have a book club around Yuval Harari's book, Sapiens. It's a lot of fun. I also teach 150Q, Gender, Labor, and Love in Globalizing Asia, where we discuss a range of political and economic and social issues facing women across Asia and also transgender people in Asia. I also teach Global Studies 151Q, Global China, where we study the history of the political and economic system in China, as well as how society has responded. I also teach in the political economy major, P101, Contemporary Theories of Political Economy, where we cover a range of scholars from Keynes and Hayek and Friedman to a range of contemporary scholars. And we talk about a range of topics like inequality, climate change, and development. Finally, I teach P156, which is an upper division class about the history of Silicon Valley and the global economy. And we looked at the factors that make this region an innovation hub. So now I want to dive into one of my courses, Global China. And in this course, I emphasize active learning. What do I mean by that? I encourage more classroom discussion and hold fewer long lectures. I try to encourage a meaningful dialogue between students from the US, China, and around the world. So to give you an example, this semester, we have students from mainland China, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Indonesia, Korea, and France. And all of the students from those different countries have an opportunity to share their perspective on China and the US from where they live. Thirdly, one of the major requirements in this course is a team debate. And these debates teach students how to do research, write a brief, prepare persuasive arguments, practice public speaking, challenge their own assumptions that they may have about controversial topics, learn how to read an audience and think on their feet, and finally, perhaps most importantly, to work effectively with others in a team setting. Weekly assignments provide students regular opportunities to hone their reading and writing skills and to get feedback from me. So that's my active learning approach. So let me give you an example of one of our debates. So this is the debate motion. China's Greater Bay Area will surpass Silicon Valley as the world's tech innovation hub. So I write the debate motion. Then one team will argue for this position and argue about the strengths of the GBA, whereas the against team will argue that Silicon Valley will in fact endure as the world's tech innovation hub. So in preparation for the debate, the team members write individual research briefs using UC Berkeley's extensive libraries. I invite a librarian every year to teach the students how to do research in the library, which is very useful because I have a range of required sources students have to find. I think of it like a scavenger hunt. They have to find books, peer-reviewed journal articles, newspaper articles published in Asia and in the United States. And then the for and against teams meet on their own to strategize, coordinate, and practice their arguments before the debate. And then on debate day, we hold a pre-debate vote to gauge the audience, where they're at on the debate motion. And then each team provides an opening statement. Then the other team has a chance to give a rebuttal to the opposite team's opening statement. And then there are closing statements. And at the end of debate, we hold a vote to determine the winner of the debate. And finally, there's a debrief in which each team member can share what they learned in the research process and the process of the debate itself. And then there's a short Q&A from the audience. So all of this happens within the 1.5 hour time frame of the class. So if you don't know a lot about the GBA, it's in southern China, and it encompasses several cities, which I'll share in a moment. But the government is trying to create an integrated region of all of these cities, and as a region to compete with the Tokyo Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area, and the New York area, and become really one of the world's leading hubs. So within that Greater Bay Area are a number of cities you may or may not have heard of, including Hong Kong, a global financial hub, Guangzhou, a global manufacturing center, Shenzhen, already a global R&D and high-tech center, and Macau, a global tourism hub, a place some have called Asia's Las Vegas. So China is building infrastructure such as high-speed transport and bridges to link all of these regions and really provide an opportunity from innovators to travel across cities. So in this debate, this was our pre-debate vote. This is what it looks like. This semester, in the beginning of the debate, there were 2 students that voted for the motion, 9 against, and 11 were undecided. So that was good. That meant that there were a lot of students whose minds could be changed by effective arguments. So next, I'm going to share with you the debate slides and what each team argued this year. So the for team had 3 arguments. The first one had to do with the GBA's prosperous location, the 5 ports in the region, the 2 economic zones, access to China's vast and sophisticated supply chain, which enables easy, low-cost prototyping, the transportation between the cities, and a growing community of innovators. Second was their argument about centralized government support for R&D. They have tax breaks that they're offering. They're encouraging collaboration between local governments and companies, encouraging education, including in investing in over a dozen new universities in this part of China, and lots of long-term planning initiatives. Finally, they argued that the GBA size and scale already outclasses Silicon Valley. The region already has a much higher GDP, dominance in international patent applications. They're a gateway to China's massive domestic market and the world's largest middle class, rising middle class, and a lot of advantages in leading technologies such as artificial intelligence, next generation batteries, and 5G telecommunications networks. So the for team had a great set of arguments. The against team also had a great set of arguments. Remember, the against team is really trying to showcase how Silicon Valley will endure as the world's tech hub. So first, they say Silicon Valley has a better environment of innovation. What do they mean by that? Dense, highly skilled labor market that is enabled through immigration. So that has to do with America's open immigration policies and how world-class research universities within the region, including Berkeley, Stanford, Santa Clara, Davis, many other universities in our region, how they attract global talent from all around the world who then stay and work for startups or who are entrepreneurs to found their own startups. And of course, the Valley also has a high concentration of venture capital funds to fund these new startups. Second, whereas the for team was arguing that Chinese central planning was a benefit to the region, this team was arguing that the central planning would harm the region because preferential policies for Chinese firms would disadvantage foreign firms. They thought that would lead to a lot of foreign firms not wanting to invest in the region, and that there would also be a misallocation of R&D, R&D and spending, and a mismatch between economic and political goals. Because a lot of this funding is politically determined and not market driven, this team was arguing that a lot of money would be wasted, a lot of inefficient investment, which China does have a history of. And finally, this team said the GBA is still a dream. It doesn't exist yet because there have been a lot of problems with integration, particularly Hong Kong and Macau, which have their own administrative systems, their own legal systems. And there are still a lot of cultural and legal differences between these different cities. And the government still doesn't have solutions to solve these problems. So this team was trying to sow doubt about the future of the GBA. So what happened at the end of the debate? Well, 5 students voted for the motion, 12 against, and 5 were still undecided. So that meant each team gained a net of 3 votes. So actually it turned out to be a tie, which is pretty unusual because usually we do have a winner. But both of these teams really did a great job. And so it ended up as a tie. But students have given me great feedback about debates. They enjoy working in teams. They enjoy the competitive spirit of it. And it makes for sort of an exciting class. And we have several debates over the course of the semester. Everyone gets to participate. So in conclusion, will GBA overtake the Silicon Valley? Well, the truth is, it's still too early to tell. Chinese government has only started investing heavily in the region in the last few years. It may take many years to bear the fruit of their investments. But it is clear many Chinese firms are already emerging as global leaders in certain sectors. Huawei in IT, they're the only company in the world with end-to-end 5G solutions, from the cell towers and telecom equipment all the way down to the cell phones. Tencent is a social media and gaming company, largest gaming company in the world. You may not have heard of it, but you will hear of it soon. They already have offices in the US trying to penetrate the US market. SF Express is one of China's leading logistics companies that provides logistics for many of Chinese companies. SenseTime is a leading AI company. DJI, is the world's largest drone maker. So you may not have heard of the company, but probably many of you have seen DJI manufactured drones. I wouldn't be surprised if you will soon see DJI manufactured drones flying Amazon packages to your doorstep. And finally, the last company I'll mention is BGI Group in Shenzhen. It's a leading genomic sequencing company, which is already making great strides in the area of sequencing the human genome, for example. But of course, there are many challenges ahead for China. They have challenges in international branding, IP protection, bottom-up innovation, the sort of kind of ecosystem of venture capital and legal protections for startups. That's still being developed in China. And if you're someone who believes that a diverse talent pool is important for innovation, as I do, this is a challenge for China. If you'd like to learn more about these topics, I encourage you to watch this documentary. You can Google it, In the Age of AI. It's a frontline documentary from a few years ago. It's excellent, has a whole section on Chinese AI. Kai-Fu Lee, one of the world's experts on Chinese AI, wrote this book, AI Superpowers, China, Silicon Valley, and the New World Order, published a few years ago. And finally, you can watch Unresolved, the Technomic Cold War with China, an Intelligence Squared US debate. It's a fun way to learn about this issue. And it was Intelligence Squared US that got me thinking about using debates in my classroom. So thank you so much for watching. And I hope to see you all in class soon. And again, if you'd like to contact me, please email me at crystalchang@berkeley.edu.
Thank you, Crystal, for that very engaging and inspiring talk. Now, with these 3 professors' presentations, I hope we have given you a sense of what we do here in the global studies. But mind you, these are only 3 slices of our program that offers a great variety of courses. In the future, we will bring other brilliant global studies professors to this website. So stay tuned. We hope to see you in our classes. Thank you.